Hello and welcome to Arts 24. My guest today has been hailed as one of Britain's best young novelists. British Palestinian writer Isabella Hammad first entered the spotlight with her award-winning debut, The Parisian, about a young Palestinian man navigating the political tumult of the early 20th century. Her second novel brings us to the West Bank in 2017. Enter Ghost came out earlier this year. It explores art, resistance, and cultural identity. Isabella Hammad, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, we scheduled this interview, of course, before the eruption of the unprecedented violence we've seen in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. Perhaps you could just start by talking about what the past couple of weeks have been like for you.
Of course. Well, it's been devastating to see this amount of violence, to see, I think it's more than 6,500 Palestinians now killed in Gaza. 2,000 of them are children. And to see not only this amount of violence is such a shock to the system, so we're all, stunned and grieving, but also the ways in which the American government, this government, other European governments are actively supporting, if not directly aiding, this military action, what the Israeli genocide and Holocaust studies Professor Raz Segal has called the textbook case of genocide. So this is gravely serious and it's hard to feel like everything's an understatement. It's truly obscene, and also the way in which the mainstream media directly feeds into it has systematically dehumanized Palestinians, and the way this directly feeds into policy at the highest level, which directly feeds into military aid, which directly feeds into massacring thousands, is harrowing.
And you grew up in London, but you still have family in the West Bank, and you first went there when you were in your early 20s. You were born around the time of the Oslo Accords. Do you still have hope for a two-state solution or for any kind of solution at all?
I mean, it's sort of hard to talk about that right now. I feel like what we're looking at is an apartheid structure that's basically accepted that is the reality. It's an apartheid regime where Palestinians live under different legal statuses than Israelis. So we have to dismantle apartheid in whatever solution, it's two-state, one-state, I don't really care, but that has to be dismantled, and that's a collective international responsibility to dismantle that.
It's such a difficult time for people in all parts of that area. As I processed the news this week, I was reading your book, Enter Ghost. Unlike your first novel, it's set in contemporary times. It's in 2017. We follow the actress Sonia, who, divorced and reeling from a love affair, returns to her family's homeland to visit her sister and gets involved in a West Bank production of Hamlet. How did the idea for this book kind of come together in your mind?
It came about, well, I was interested in theatre in general as an art form, particularly in the context of a military regime that's very sort of performative. It's about kind of bodies in space, the control of people moving through space. So theatre as an art form that's all about bodies in space, taking up space, with a particular history in Palestine. I felt like it was something interesting to play around with. And there's a wonderful film actually called Arne's Children by Juliano Merchamis, which is about his mother setting up a theatre school for children in Jenin refugee camp, which I saw when I was quite young, which was sort of where that idea started to germinate. And then Hamlet has its own particular history as well, so it was something that's kind of how I got to that.
And can you tell us about that history of Hamlet and why you picked that play in particular?
Yeah, I mean, initially I just thought, well, it's good to choose a play that even if your readership, they don't all know Shakespeare well, but you kind of might know something basic about Shakespeare. You might know to be or not to be. You might know there's a ghost. You have some basic things that don't need explaining or don't need too much explaining. And then I found that Hamlet itself had been banned in the Israeli prisons because it was seen as a dangerous text, because it's all about a man seeking to avenge a great crime, a dispossession. And it also has a particular history in Egypt as well. So there was I felt like there were these other undertones I could tap on, could bring out thematically that made it a fun text to play with.
Yeah, the characters kind of talk about all those different undertones, which is interesting as well. This novel also full of ghosts, not just the ghost in Hamlet. Let's have you read a short excerpt from it. This is from when Sonia has just entered the West Bank for the first time as a young teenager.
Of course. As we turned past a building with a burnt facade, the word territory rang around in my head. It comes with the territory. That's not my territory. Occupied territory. Enemy territory. Unknown territory. What exactly happened on this road to cause this mess? And where were the people standing when whatever it was had happened? What weapons had they used? Had the soldiers used?
How had that block of concrete ended up there, and that sheet of metal there, and who had died, and how many were arrested? Over the contents of the window pane, a blend of television reels ran and filled the empty streets with action. If Israel was the inside, then that made this, the West Bank, an outside, a borderland, a neither here nor there. And yet as Jad's car descended the road to Bethlehem, opening on the right-hand side a vista of terraced fields, how much it felt like exiting through the mirror and entering the real, going deeper and deeper into the heartland.
Shifting territories and checkpoints are also just such a big feature of this book, in part because your novel really draws attention to the different legal statuses among Palestinians, and that's something I think it was important for you to convey.
Yeah, the book sort of, it kind of insists on historic Palestine being a contiguous geography, that all of these Palestinians with different legal statuses, so we've got Palestinian Jerusalemites, Palestinians from the West Bank, internally displaced refugees, Palestinians in exile, and Palestinian citizens of Israel. There isn't a character from Gaza in the play, but that absence is gestured to because it was too unrealistic to expect them to participate in a play being put on in the West Bank. But that kind of, so this space of the play, of this sort of creative act, is also an act of kind of coming together, of engaging with that fractured body politic that has been deliberately separated by the Israeli regime.
Yeah, the characters all have kind of different legal statuses, and there's also tension around sort of different levels of political engagement. Sonia, the main character, for example, sort of struggles with her identity as someone from the diaspora who decided to stay outside of Palestine and make her life elsewhere, versus her sister who stayed. She's a professor in Haifa. How do you see that relationship between Palestinian identity and political engagement? Are they sort of inextricable from each other at this point?
Well, I mean, to be Palestinian is sort of to be immediately politicized in many ways, but I think that within that you have all sorts of range of personalities and psychologies that might respond to those conditions, right? So this protagonist is somebody who feels kind of ambivalent about it, but she moves over the course of the book to sort of a stronger engagement, to a sort of stronger sense of her responsibility as a Palestinian with these bonds to these other people, right? But her sister takes another stance. But I suppose I'm interested in the kind of the psychology of that, that it's also about family dynamics, that one sister goes one way, another goes another, and that I feel is a sort of very novelistic, the sort of stuff of storytelling in a way.
Yeah, no, it's worth mentioning that your novels are very political, but at the same time have to do with interpersonal relationships, with family relationships, with romance. You mentioned the fact that Palestinians are naturally politicized in spite of themselves, and it's worth mentioning that in the wake of the Hamas attacks in Israel, many cultural institutions have postponed events featuring Palestinian artists. The Frankfurt Book Fair, for example, canceled an award ceremony for the Palestinian author, Adania Shibli. What do you make of those decisions?
I mean, it's gravely disappointing that at a moment when Palestinian voices really need to be heard in the West, that those voices are being deliberately excluded or censored. I mean, you're seeing Palestinian op-eds being killed at the last minute. You're seeing Palestinian appearances on television being cancelled at the last minute. You're also seeing people who are speaking up in solidarity with Palestinians being cancelled. I mean, it's really extraordinary. It's not only is it, I mean, obviously completely undemocratic and sinister that should be happening, but it also shows you that sustaining an apartheid system requires the manufacturing of consent internationally, and the policing of speech and the censorship of the oppressed and those who speak on their behalf. I also think it's worth pointing out that Palestinians don't really have the infrastructure to speak to the world. They don't have kind of like established ways of expressing their viewpoint in the same way as most other people. So it's striking that these attacks on free speech are being directed at individual artists and writers. So that really should tell people something. They should ask why are they so afraid that a Palestinian should speak? Yeah. But also, Adania Shibli's book is really fantastic. So I would also encourage your viewers to get their hands on a copy. It's a really great book. Yeah,
it certainly deprives the public of voices when they probably need to hear them most. One example here in Paris is the Arab World Institute. It postponed some events in relation to its exhibition, What Palestine Brings to the World. We also learned that a young artist from Gaza, Mohammed Sami, was killed in the recent fighting. He was part of the Hawaf collective that created one of the works in the exhibition. We can hear now from the institution's director and former French culture minister, Jacques Lang, talking about the decision to postpone some of those events and about the exhibition itself.
When Hamas invaded Israel and committed crimes, we felt we couldn't peacefully host meetings, and so we decided to postpone them until a later date. My wish with this exhibition was that Palestine, which for years has been sidelined, forgotten, and even scorned, could be represented through the many dimensions of its culture.
Isabella, I know that you saw this exhibition. What did you think of it? Did you feel like it did justice to representing those many dimensions of Palestinian identity?
I mean, you know, what actually I found really moving about the exhibition, which is sort of based on this idea of a future museum of modern art for Palestine, is actually that much of the art displayed wasn't exclusively Palestinian artists. So there was also this sort of implication of a Palestinian viewing public, that Palestine is not only a place or a cause to be viewed, but also might have a critical lens of its own, and I found that very moving as well. I also really liked the section about Jean Genet, about his briefcases and the papers and manuscripts, which also engages with the time he spent with the Fedayeen in Jordan in the 70s and with the Black Panthers.
Yeah, the French writer, Jean Genet.
Yeah, the French writer, Jean Genet, exactly. So one of his books, his book about the Palestinians called, in English, A Prisoner of Love, was one of the books I was reading when I started writing this. So it was also kind of wonderful for me to look at that. It's a book that is about, I mean, there are lots of images in it that I draw on in the novel, but it's also about illusion and the sort of teetering between being and not being, which Palestinians are always engaging with to a certain degree. Will they or won't they?
Isabella Hammad, thank you again so much for speaking with us. Meaningful to have your voice right now. A reminder that her second novel, Enter Ghost, is out in bookstores. We'll end with more images from that exhibition, What Palestine Brings to the World. Those in Paris have a few more weeks to see it. It's running until November 19th. Thank you so much for watching. There's news coming up on France 24 after this.